So today we'll be diving deeper into the decolonization of global health movements, and we're speaking with a global health leader who has been at the forefront of the decolonizing movement before it even became vogue. Our guest today is Dr. Catherine Kyobutungi. Catherine serves as the executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center and has decades of experience working in Africa to improve the health of people across the continent. Her research focuses on chronic disease management, non-communicable disease, and health system responsiveness. She has been at the forefront of the decolonizing global health movement and has written extensively on the topic. And I should add, if you don't already follow her on Twitter, you should definitely do so. So welcome, Catherine. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Des, and thanks, Yao. I'm happy to be here and happy to be your first guest, Yao, as a co-host.
So you wrote in a recent opinion in PLOS Global Public Health, of which you are the co-editor in chief, and you wrote about anti-blackness, and you said that anti-blackness is an inescapable consequence of global health evolution from colonial medicine and its white supremacy. Now, obviously, an incredibly loaded sentence with many things to potentially unpack, but perhaps we could start off with what is anti-blackness, or what, in your definition, would you say is anti-blackness?
Thanks, Yao, and thanks, Des. When you wrote that opinion piece, I actually didn't think that was such a loaded statement. It's almost like obvious, right? Because, I remember my first lecture in public health many years ago when I was doing my master's. And we had a lecture on the history of public health. And it was, for me, the first time to realize how public health generally had colonial roots. And so for me, it's something which is obvious. And when you say it's loaded, I'm like, how? Isn't that obvious that this is what it's about? But anyhow, so anti-blackness really has many definitions. And in the recent past, I've been reflecting about how this whole debate around decolonization, at least to us who are in global health, has become more prominent. But there are people who've been in the trenches for many, many, many years. And so some of these concepts like anti-blackness have been there for years. And we are just sort of being alive to these concepts and how they apply to global health. So it's not a definition that comes from the global health field. It's a definition which has been there for many years. It has been defined in many different ways. In some instances, in reference to Black Americans. In other instances, in general, in reference to Black people. But really, it's a setup in which Black people, whether it's their cultural preferences, whether it's their knowledge, whether it's their bodies and minds, are deemed to be inferior, and therefore they are treated in a way that is dehumanizing, that can be discriminatory. And I think we can accept that all this, if you look at the African context, this is the result of colonialism, because the colonial conquest really was based on dominating these savage minds and savage bodies that needed to be civilized. And so it's not a surprise that many years later, that kind of thinking about the Black body persists. So anti-blackness, you can put all these things, racism, they come under that. It's really looking at Black bodies and Black minds. And in your mind, consciously or subconsciously, seeing an inferior being that requires your intervention to save them from whatever it is that you want to save them. And so that's why I say that global health is steeped into that. We've not liberated our minds from the drivers of the colonial conquest. Many years later, we still see African minds or Black minds as those that require intervention and those that require saving, and those that can be ignored, those that can be discriminated against without consequence. I think that is the biggest thing, that you can get away with anything by oppressing the Black mind or the Black body. And that's the system we live in. And the global health system is set up in that way.
So, I mean, no, I think that is clearly, it's thought provoking, and yes, you're right. It's almost so obvious. Perhaps you could expand a little bit, maybe with some concrete examples in your experience of manifestations of this anti-blackness attitude. I mean, I think we can think of broad general sort of situations where it may have arisen, but it may be helpful especially for the some of the audience who may not actually live on the continent, who have not experienced this themselves, if they can give a couple of concrete examples of how this anti-Blackness manifests in global health as it's practiced on the continent.
I think the pervasive manifestation of anti-Blackness really is in the perception of the African mind as inferior. So it's not so much about the African body, it's the African mind. Our knowledge is inferior, our practices are inferior. And even when we've sort of been swallowed up by this Western system of education, we're still perceived as less than. And so we're in a global health system where decisions which affect the African continent are not usually made on the African continent. People sit somewhere in Geneva, or they sit somewhere in DC or New York, and they make big decisions about what is right for Africa. And then, of course, we are here, we sit and we consume the products of those decisions. I think that is the most pervasive anti-Blackness that we see. So when you think about anti-Blackness, it's not that people are actively doing things to harm the Black body directly, but it is that perception that somehow we are inferior, and therefore people need to define problems for us, and they need to define solutions for us. I think for me that is much more pervasive and maybe much more harmful than the things which are direct, because the things which are direct, I think there are many systems that sort of mitigate them. So there's that. Now, when you ask yourself, how does it manifest? In our article, we said from visa apartheid, so from visa denials to vaccine apartheid. And so visa denials are a small thing. Okay, they can be big for you as a scientist. If you're an African scientist and you want to go for a conference in Canada and you can't get a visa, for you as an individual, it's something which is humiliating, it's something which is painful. But then when you think about vaccine apartheid, that is something which affected the whole African continent. So the manifestations are somewhere in between. Things which affect us as individual Africans, when you want to do things that help us, but also help the African continent, to things which affect everybody, whether they are aware of it or not. So the visa apartheid is the first thing. Like, there are very many stories of the International AIDS Conference, that, whichever other conference, the American, Society of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine Conference. There are all those things which happen where global health has become this, I would say, field that is steeped in careerism. People build careers in global health. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, we are building these careers for what exactly? So it's like this thing which you practice and you build a career and you get a job and you grow into it without ever stopping to question, why am I doing what I'm doing? Because global health, as defined, was set up to ensure that there's equity across the world. But there are many things which are happening which have nothing to do with equity. People take up global health as a career the same way you take up football or music or comedy. The purpose of football is not to achieve equity. The purpose of comedy is not to achieve equity. The purpose of global health is to achieve equity. But it is so steeped in careerism that people don't even question, why are you having a conference on malaria in America, in the United States of America? Why? Because malaria research is a career for people. If it wasn't a career, it would not make any sense at all that you have so many practitioners of malaria in the US that you think it's right to hold a conference there. And when Africans want to come for this conference, Africans who have suffered from malaria, who have family members who have suffered from malaria, who have lost family members to malaria, who deal with malaria on a daily basis, when they want to come for this conference, then you put all these hoops that they have to jump through to attend this conference. Because you, the person that is based in whichever part of America, is the malaria expert. You've built a career in malaria, and therefore the table is set for you. You can just take a train or drive your car and sit at this table. The African has to jump through all these hoops. And yet malaria is predominantly an African problem. So that is the thing of, you have to jump through hoops to sit at this table because people have taken your problem and they've built careers out of it. That is anti-Blackness. So that is on the side of the visa apartheid. So Africans are deprived of opportunities to share their experiences, to share their research, to build their profiles, to become visible as experts. Because, as I've said, the careerism in global health leads to this definition of expertise. that is accepted. So Africans are sort of kept out of becoming experts on things that affect them on the daily. That is, as I said, one side of it. But on the extreme side, I think is the vaccine apartheid. And for me, that was such an eye-opening. It wasn't a moment. I think it was an eye-opening experience that we live in a world where I'm sure there are people sitting somewhere in a room, maybe different rooms, that sat down and said, nah, it's okay. We are going to distribute vaccines this way. And it does not matter at all to them, to us, of these people in the room. It does not matter at all to them that Africans, you're not getting vaccines. It did not matter at all. What kind of system is that? And it's a global health system whose fundamental goal is to achieve equity. Where's the equity in that? And it's if you look at the distribution of the vaccine coverage, the COVID vaccine coverage, it's only the African continent which has a certain share. There's no other continent that looks like Africa. It's only the African continent that has a certain shade of how low the vaccine coverage was. So even even the pandemic like COVID-19 did not shake this anti-Black system. Not at all.
I can relate to that, Catherine. I remember attending. I've attended many international conferences. The biggest one, obviously, in North America is the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. I remember attending that a few times and just thinking, why am I here? Like, it's rather bizarre to have people talking about research that is done in Zambian when the Zambians are not in the room and able to really take that information because of visa denials. So I think that's a great example. But I'd like to return to a point that you made earlier, which is this idea that knowledge from Africans, from Black people, is inferior. I remember, reading about the decolonizing movements of like post-colonial Africa, and a lot of it focused on decolonizing our minds. Right? There's the idea of decolonizing the minds of the colonizers, because those who colonize have grown up in a system that has probably allowed them to think that they're inferior to Black people. But then a big motive for colonization was also it changed the minds of those who were colonized, right? That they think that they're also inferior. So I wonder if maybe this is a difficult thing to ask you, but do you think that we still need to decolonize our minds in Africa, in the South?
Oh, wow. I mean, every time I think about the decolonization movement, and I think that's the most daunting part about how much our minds are colonized, that the colonialists left. I mean, there are writers who have talked about flag independence. Like there was flag independence, but there was never independence. Because we raised the flags, but we kept the education system, we kept the healthcare system, we kept the knowledge system, because the education system is a small part of the knowledge system, maybe a big part, but we have a broader knowledge system. There's something about different ways of knowing. We kept the Western way of knowing what is knowledge, what is important. And so that's like the most daunting part, because people are getting churned out through this pipeline, this assembly line of indoctrination in the colonial way of knowing, in the Western way of knowing. And so you have people who are in decision-making roles. You have people like the broader society, the most highly educated Africans. Their worldview is shaped by the education system. And that is the education system is still steeped into colonialism. So, of course, we need to liberate the African mind. We need to liberate the colonized mind. And I think that's the most difficult part of this decolonization. And as I said, sometimes it looks daunting. It's like, where do we even start? Where do you even start? You're talking to people and their worldview, really, whether it's from your hair, what is good hair, whether it's from the way you dress, from the way you talk, your name, everything is so deeply entrenched in the colonial way of thinking. So where do you even start talking about the big things like oppression? you'd be shocked. I mean, I engage in different social media platforms, especially WhatsApp, and I belong to many different groups. And sometimes you ask yourself, like, where do you even start? Sometimes you don't even know where to start, because when people's worldview is so steeped into colonial thought, then it becomes even difficult to talk about some of the more pertinent things. I engage in so many debates. When you think about feminist debates, you find people's worldview is informed by the Bible. So where do you even start to start like deconstructing the mind when people's everything is so steeped? The Bible said this, Jesus said that. I don't know Proverbs which verse, and I don't know Corinthians which verse. Where do you even start? We've not even talked about things that, feminism maybe is not so controversial. It is controversial to a certain extent, but there are things like sexual minorities. Where do you even start? People talk about Leviticus, I don't know which verse and which one or the other, and their whole worldview is informed by that one verse. So, as I said, there's a lot to think about when you think about decolonization. The education system is not serving us. The education system, we talk about even corporal punishment. You'd be shocked at the kinds of debates I have with people in 2023 about corporal punishment and not understanding that some of these are colonial relics. The education system was set up to serve the colonial master, to produce Africans who are compliant, who are conformists, who would not question authority, and who toe the line and be good servants to the colonial masters. And when the colonialists left, we kept that system. So we are still producing people. They are not servants to colonialists, but they are servants to other powers. They are servants to our politicians, the political class, the capitalists, the capitalistic system. And it's the same education system. We have debates about boarding school. We have debates about shaving girls' hair in boarding school. All these are things that were put in place to develop a conformist workforce on the African continent. And many decades later, we keep them. Why do we keep them? Because that's how we are trained. We don't know any better. So where do you even start?
Well, if I can add something to that, a concrete example, Catherine, is, in my own country, Cameroon, we're fighting what I would call a colonial war right now. We refer to ourselves as Anglophones and Francophones.
Yep.
And those systems and that identity has remained within us, that two people from the same tribe can have the identity of Anglophone and Francophone. And along with it, those systems have remained. So right now there's a war that's happening over which educational system, whether we should be using the French or the British educational systems, whether we should be using the French or the UK common law, the English common law, right? That we're really literally killing ourselves over this. And I keep wondering, can't we figure out our own systems rather than killing? By the way, those systems, the British and the French don't use any longer. It's a colonial system that we're killing ourselves over.
Not at all.
But obviously there are some discussions, some good discussions that are happening in decolonizing global health so far. And I wonder if you can give us your diagnosis or prognosis of how the decolonizing global health movement is happening, because it is happening. There are discussions that are happening, but is it, what does it accomplish? Where do you think it can be improved, or where is it failing?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag, to be honest. There's been some progress, some of it surprising, but then there's a danger of stagnation, but also there's a danger of sort of distorting the overall aims of the decolonization global health movement, and maybe doing the wrong things with good intent, but still the wrong things. So I would say it's a mixed bag. First of all, I think the level of conversation has been good. And the only problem is that majority of these conversations are happening in the global north. I'll use quote unquote. Not as many conversations are happening in the targets of decolonization, if I could call it that. which is problematic in its own way, but I won't go there. So there are lots and lots of conversations which are happening about this. And I think for many people in the global north, I think they are becoming alive to this reality. And many years, maybe 5 years ago, some of these conversations were unfathomable because they were very uncomfortable, but now they're happening. And whether there's some kind of discomfort, whether they're uncomfortable, they are happening. So I think that's progress. The fact that a lot of global health players are open to having these conversations. I think maybe one encouraging sign is that it's happening a lot among the younger generation. So there are lots of graduate courses, graduate schools that are having these conversations. They're having webinars, they're having courses. I do give lots and lots of lectures in global health, masters classes here and there. So that is a good thing that there's a conversation happening. But at some point, you have to ask ourselves, is it enough to keep on talking and without coming up with concrete, actions about the talking? So on one side, that's a positive. On the other side, I would say that funders or global health programs or global health research have also taken action. And I think funders are a critical player. In a way, they are catalysts because they shape what gets done. They shape what research gets funded, and therefore what research is done. They shape which programs get funded and therefore get implemented. And they've taken some measures. I wouldn't say it's uniform across the world, but I would say that UK-based funders, US-based funders, Canadian funders, funding agencies, they've taken some action around decolonization, but through the framing is equitable partnerships or diversity, equity, and inclusion. They have different ways of framing this, but the aim really is to end up decolonizing in one way or the other. Decolonization may not be the immediate aim, but they're taking steps which contribute to decolonization. So I think funders maybe have been the most surprising at how open they are to change and how quickly actually some of them have implemented change. So there's been some progress. Now that is the positive side. Now the negative side is how I would say the movement is, I think, in danger of being bastardized and sort of narrowing it down. These are really big systemic issues, but narrowing it down to things that they are checklists. They're checklists all over. If you do X, tick this box, then you're decolonizing. You need to do X, Y, Z. So those are everywhere, and I think that's a danger that we can bastardize. You can bastardize the movement and not focus on the big things, the systemic things that need to happen. And then, of course, as I've said, a lot of the conversations are happening, not too many of them happening on the African continent. And when we had this webinar, we had a webinar in Nairobi a few months back where this paper that you referred to came from. You'd be surprised at some of the audience reactions. Some of them were hearing these debates for the first time. And this is within the institution that I lead. Most of the audience were there, but of course there were other participants. So these conversations are not happening on the African continent as much, at least, as I would like to see. And beyond that, I think the question of what does decolonization mean for us as Africans and what do we need to do, I think that is still an open question. And in some ways, you almost feel like the colonization movement is so deeply entrenched that those on the other side, the decolonized movement, I think we need to be a little bit more systematic and organized and structured. Because right now, I think that many players are doing little things here and there. And sometimes you ask yourself, who is this organizing force that is going to bring us all in the same room and say, this is how we're moving forward as Africa? I think we're missing that. And so, so it's a mixed bag. We've made progress, but we should not relax because there's a danger that progress can be undone. But we should also be conscious of bastardizing the movement, and we end up with crumbs, really, rather than the big structure changes that we want to see.
Yeah, no, I find that very powerful. I personally, as I've tried to grow up within this movement, I find that sometimes the biggest detractors are actually some Africans themselves. You expect to get pushback from the colonizer, But when your fellow colony, or whatever what the word is, colonized individual, is so beholden to the quote unquote master that they actually hold back, often young Africans who are trying to chart a new way. It can be incredibly frustrating and quite disheartening. And actually, I mean, in the paper, you say, it is time for Africans to claim the seat they have historically denied at the global health decision making table. It is time to abandon the charity model. I really like that, the charity model of global health, and demand a model that is rooted in equity, human rights, justice, and self determination. And I think that last piece, self determination, clearly puts it in the court of the African, or of the person who has been colonized. That, you know, I typically use the example of Ghana's own independence struggle. Independence wasn't given to us. It was something people fought and died for. And I think perhaps scientists need to recognize that it's a similar situation. Hopefully nobody has, hopefully it will not be as bloody as it was for political independence. But perhaps it will be, because as you said, people's careers are based on this system. They don't know anything else. So yeah, I guess the question for me is, what do you see as the role of Africans? I often find there's a bit of a generational gap, that emerges sometimes. But even some younger scientists are also overly, colonized in their own minds. So, what is the role of the African, within this movement? Those from the global South in decolonizing the movement, and how do we hold our leaders accountable? How do younger scientists hold their leaders accountable? How do colleagues hold other colleagues accountable in sort of this journey towards self-determination?
Yeah, I mean, every time we talk about Africans, there are also different types of Africans. There are different constituencies when you think about this. So, of course, the Africans like us. I mean, I'm there. I'm 50 years old, 51. I lead an African institution. I literally have nothing to lose when it comes to my career, and so there I have a certain role. And I remember that we had a recent forum where somebody said the same thing. That honestly, as Africans, when you reach a certain level in your career, you can't just still be this timid, conformist, afraid person. Like, there's nobody who's going to come from somewhere and come and start fighting for Africans. It's us, the Africans, who have reached a certain level in our careers, and we can't stay away from these fights. So there are those Africans, like me, that need to step up and start speaking for the continent. But speaking requires exposing yourself to some of these things and asking yourself, is Africa getting a raw deal within this whole system? And the answer is yes. So if you're getting a raw deal, then we can't keep on perpetuating the status quo and accepting to be, I don't even know, third or fourth class citizens in the world, where the system is just there and we are always at the bottom of the queue, always at the end of the queue. We can't accept that. So there are certain Africans who need to step up and stop this, as I said, conformist fear of, oh my God, there'll be consequences. I don't think the consequences can be worse with what pertains to the African continent. So there's that class of Africans. And then, of course, there's as you said, there are generational gaps. So there are people who are in our footsteps, and then there are people who are at the beginning of their careers. I think we have a responsibility and a duty, those of us who are in the fight, who understand, to, number one, pass on the gospel of decolonization, and pass on the gospel of how the world works, so people understand that this is how the world works, and unless we fight for it, the world is not going to fight for us. So there's a responsibility to I think increase awareness. I don't like that because it's, in a way, it's a bit passive, but there's a beginning point of having a common understanding of what are we up against, because that is not widespread. As you said, you get pushback because people don't know any better. People are afraid of losing their grant. People are afraid of losing their fellowship to go for this conference. But perhaps there are bigger things. If we fight, we can fight for bigger things. We can fight for bigger grants. We can fight for bigger conferences. We can fight for conferences in our own localities. So the getting a common understanding of what we're up against, we have a responsibility to bring everybody on board to have that common understanding. And then, of course, coming up with solutions and ideas What can we as Africans do? And so we can't, the reason why I hate decolonization as a concept, it means you sit, you are colonized, you sat and you are colonized, now you sit and you get decolonized. So as an organizing framework, it's fine, but when you start to unpack it, it sort of also takes away agency from us as Africans. But it's there. It has been conceptualized. It has legs. So we have to ask ourselves, what is our role to play in that, and how do we sit down and determine what are the things we need to do? And so I look at decolonization in different phases. There are things we need to do now. There are things we need to do 5 years from now. There are things which are going to take us a generation. And then there are things which may never happen in our lifetime, like throwing out the whole education system, which is churning out these conformists. That is something which perhaps I don't think I want to deal with. It's you guys, the yours, who are a bit younger than me. But when you think about decolonization, they are like things which are like 20 years, 30 years in the future. But there are things which are now. And that's why perhaps funders have taken the equitable partnership route, because it's doable. So the question is, if funders are looking for equitable partnerships, how are we as Africans responding to this? My biggest fear, actually, is that a few years from now, the funders are going to pack up their bags and go back to the status quo, because they're not receiving, they're sort of supplying equitable partnerships, and there's no demand for equitable partnerships on the ground. And so as an organization, as APHLC, as me, we are really trying to see how do you build the capabilities of African continent so they can meet this new way, or this goodwill, or this, I don't know, this thinking around equitable partnerships. How do you build the capabilities? Because the system has been set up in such a way that African institutions, in spite of decades and decades and decades of investment in capacity building, capacity strengthening, even up to date, the commensurate capacity does not exist. There is capacity, but not commensurate to what has been invested, quote unquote, in capacity strengthening. And of course, the system is set up in such a way that structurally African institutions are not set up to meet this demand. And so funders are quick to say, oh, we are doing DEI, we're doing equitable partnerships, we're doing localization, without asking themselves, what are you doing to prepare the institutions on the ground for this to happen? I can give an example. For instance, if the US government gives funding for $200 million or $300 million in initiatives, how many institutions exist on the African continent to absorb $200 million? 0, or 1, or 2, or 3. Here in the US, the institutions where careers have been built around that, there are hundreds of them. There are tens of institutions which can bid for even $500 million and absorb it and deliver it. There's hardly any institution on the African continent in global health which can bid for $500 million. I can bet if there's any, I very highly doubt it. We have a vista on the so that is the thing. So the I love you too. Okay. So the global health has existed for decades, and there's never been investment in the capabilities of institutions to absorb this level of funding. And now funders are saying, oh, we are now localizing. Who are you localizing to? And because if there's no goodwill, if there's no good intent, if the equity is not really at the heart of what is being done, if, as before, the intent is the appearance of doing good, as I said, after 5 years, you'll start seeing reversals, because the US government has a budget. They need to give us $2 billion. And if $2 billion cannot be given out through localization, after a while, they'll go back to the usual way of doing business. And ideally, there should be investments in the capabilities of African institutions to absorb the $2 billion. But that is messy. It takes time. You don't know, is it going to work? How do you show results? How do you invest in institution building and not how many bed nets were distributed? So that is it. Like, the system is not set up to build capabilities. Yep. And so as Africans, it's our duty to see what do we need to do to build capabilities on the continent? And as I said, the institution I lead, that's what we are trying to work on, to build capabilities of African institutions so that 5 years from now, we have a much bigger number of institutions which can absorb and deliver programs in a way that is more efficient, actually, from a financial perspective, and which is likely to give more value for money compared to the current model where you can put $500 million and the results you get, you could have got with 100 million if you had put this money in African institutions, but you're getting it for $500 million because of all sorts of things that exist. Yeah.
So I guess in line with that, I mean, I think you've already begun to answer this question, but there are those in the global north who, at least there are some, I believe, who have goodwill, whose hearts are in the right place, who genuinely want to see equity be established. I guess we can't paint them all with the same brush, but good intentions and outcomes don't always line up, and actually often don't line up. So, as somebody who's been in the field, you've already begun to allude to this. What advice, what can they do? So if they are funders, if they are academic partners, what can they do from the global north to help enable the decolonization of global health, to help enable African scientists or others in the developing world to be able to really become self-determinant? So if there are allies out there who have the right heart for this, what would be your advice to them? What are some concrete steps they could take to actually actualize this vision? And your
Okay, I
daughter
think there are
can
different.
I'm
your daughter
loving
can answer
I'm
too.
loving your daughter, by the way.
My son.
Maybe your
Your
son.
son.
No, sorry. And so he could
Oh
answer if
no,
he wants.
you see, they've seen you. I hid in the basement and he still tracked me down. So I mean, I think, as I said earlier, there are different players. So if you're an academic sitting in an institution and you're teaching global health, or you are a student that is enrolled in a global health program, I think the beginning point is to ask yourself, why are you there? Are you there because you want to get a degree that sets you up into a career without ever stopping to question whether your actions are going to lead to equity? And it's just a job. You could be a footballer and it wouldn't matter. So those are individual steps people need to take. Why are you in global health? Are you there to go and save some Africans somewhere? Are you going to save some women you've never met that need saving, and you're the savior that is going to do this? So that is the beginning point. But then, of course, global health programs now, when they design, they also need to start asking those questions. What are you preparing your students for? Is it a career in saviorism, or is it in a career that genuinely aims at achieving equity? And if the aim is equity, then how do you think that what you're doing is going to achieve equity? And how do you need to change your training program so that equity is at is the goal, not getting into this machinery that perpetuates inequity at the end of it all? So those are things which individuals can do. These are things which global health schools can do. But then, of course, the other players, and I said funders are a very big part of this whole ecosystem, and funders have a role to play. So I'll give an example, for instance, of UK-based funders who have changed the way that grant applications are assessed. Because in the past, it always used to be amazing science, robust design, great analytical plan, great sample size determination. It was always focused on the scientific method and how a study has been conceptualized, how it has been rationalized. It reviewed all the right literature, and the design is amazing. And that was the main consideration. And then, of course, the second thing was the team. And it didn't matter what the team composition was. But now, some funders have started questioning the team composition. It wasn't unusual to see a study being done in 5 African countries led by UK-based organization, and 70% of the budget is in UK, and 30% was going to 5 countries. It wasn't unusual. And that among the team, the applicants, the African collaborators were always to oversee data collection. That was normal. As long as the science was good, that could pass. But now that is unlikely to pass, especially with the UK funders that I'm familiar with, because now there are questions about what is the role of the African partners on the ground. And it's not acceptable to say that the African partners are to oversee data collection. No, if you have 5 work packages, we want to see the leadership of those work packages distributed equally. If there are 10 PhD fellowships, they can't all be for UK-based people, and yet you have 5 African partners. If there's a budget, the budget is £10 million, then it has to be distributed based on where the work is going to be done. This business of 70% of the money in the UK and 30% distributed among African partners, it doesn't fly anymore. And that is a deliberate step that funders have taken. But funders have also broadened the people who review these applications. I sit on several panels, and sometimes we sit on Zoom, and when people put on their Zoom screens, you want to smile because this is what the world looks like. But previously, a typical funding reviewer was a white middle-aged male. Typically, it was always like that. All the experts on things were white men. And therefore, when you came to reviewing, their worldview is, of course, informed by the worldview of a middle-aged white man who has grown up in the UK but has done research, for many years on the African continent. But now you have reviewers from different parts of the world. And so when I sit on a panel, my worldview is different from what a professor at the London School is about what is good science. My focus is on what value will Kenya get out of this science? What value will the Kenyan partner get out of this science? So I'm concerned about pathways to impact. I'm concerned about public engagement. I'm concerned about policy impact. Yes, the science is great. Yeah, the study design is amazing. Fine. But it can't be fine on its own without questioning. So what? If this science is amazing, so what? For me, I'm concerned about the so what question. And so when you sit on panels, we ask these questions. And with time, you can see change happening. So funders have a role to play in terms of looking at expertise beyond the white man, middle-aged white man, and bringing new perspectives to defining what is good science. And then, of course, they have responsibility for seeing that their funds are they're equally distributed, but they're also going to answer the so what question. It is no longer sufficient to say, I'm going to publish 15 papers from this study without telling us what is the country in which you're going to do the science going to benefit from your science. So those are things which, as I said, different people have, a different role to play. But fundamentally, I was recently in an event in Senegal, and the panel was talking about decolonization. And amazingly, the most common thread that came out of this event was that African governments, we cannot decolonize without African governments putting money in science. And of course, this has been part of the conversation, but I've never seen such unanimity in in thinking about the role of African governments. So African governments also have a role to play. But I've always maintained as an African scientist that as African scientists, part of our outreach is to see how to convince African governments to put money in science. We don't do enough outreach. We don't understand the policy-making process. We don't understand politics. We think science speaks for itself. No, it does not. So we need to do more when it comes to advocacy around African governments investing in R&D. That's a complementary path towards decolonization. For now, the other funding agencies are there to, keep the system running until the African governments can step up.
I can't tell you how many randomized control trial studies I've read where I'm just like, did this need to be an RCT? And you can imagine the amount of money that has gone into some of these studies in science. But you've already talked about some of the great progress that has made, and I see you're very active on Twitter, but there can also be a tendency for especially young people in public health and global health to become jaded by some of these discussions, right? If you're looking historically, you're saying, oh, these decolonizing conversations have been happening since Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba and all of these guys, and we're still having the same conversations, right? So one can become depressed and jaded. how do you prevent yourself from maybe falling into this line of thinking or attitude?
I mean, there are times when I just sit down and say, my goodness, this is so hopeless. And especially as I've said, when you have conversations and you realize that the thinking, the worldview that is driven by our education system, which is still very much colonial, will be very hard to uproot. It can be depressing where you're like, oh my God, this is all pointless. But then, as I've said, I think it's when you think about, the global health system does not exist in a vacuum. There's politics, there's geopolitics, there's all the global financial system, the global political system, the global economic system. So global health doesn't exist in a vacuum. And sometimes when you think about the fact that what we see in global health is a symptom of the bigger system, like the vaccine apartheid is a symptom of the bigger system. Sometimes it can be daunting, but at other times, as I've said, of course, people have been in the trenches for much longer, but I think the decolonized global health, maybe perhaps global health affects more people and it's much more visible, I think has gained maybe more traction in the last decades than general other decolonization movements. After, of course, in the post-independence world, I think decolonization was very much up there. But then for a few decades after that, I would say maybe the last 3 or 4 decades, there's not been much of that because the momentum that came with flag independence was lost, for different reasons. So this is a good moment actually to recapture the lost momentum. And as I said, it can look daunting. It can be daunting if you aim to dismantle the global system that is there, that has vested interests that are very powerful. But when you see results that are happening from like maybe not huge investments in time and effort, then you can say, okay, suppose there are more people who are investing time and effort, into some of these things, maybe we'd even see more results. So I think good results can be motivating, where you say, oh my God, I I tweeted and something happened. So you tweet, you have a tweet storm for like an hour or two, and then there are results that you can actually see. We've seen these manos, all white panels of talking about Africa, and people are like, oh, we are we are looking for other panelists. This was a mistake. So that may look like a small thing, but when those things happen, you're like, okay, my voice actually matters. But I think one thing which keeps me going is to recognize, I've said it many times, that power is not given, power has to be taken. There's nobody sitting there with power that is waiting for the best opportunity to hand it over. It has to be fought for. And so if we don't fight, no one is going to fight for us. So in a way, while it's daunting, it is us. There's no other person who's going to sit up and be fighting our battles. And while, as I've said, the decolonization global health movement has taken root in the north, mostly the global north, there's a limit to how much we can expect from that, because it still takes that paternalistic goodwill thing. Or we decolonized you, now we are going to decolonize you. That is not sufficient, because the colonizer still has interest. And so if they decolonize on their own terms, then we can't expect true decolonization. And so however daunting it is us. Africa is ours, it's our continent, and we cannot delegate its liberation to others. And we'll keep going. As Yo said, hopefully there won't be bloodshed. But as long as we're there, we'll keep going. And so that is what keeps me. But the other, as I've said, is seeing some results. And so if you're a global health student, if you're a global health practitioner, if you're in this system and everything is depressing, ask yourself, what are the little things you can do? Can you organize a webinar where people understand this? Can you organize a webinar where we share experiences about what has worked for us? Can you organize a course in your master's training, like a module around decolonization? Can you can you tweet or retweet people who are not afraid to tweet? There are things. Ask yourself. I think all of us, there's something we can do. And I think that it will be the collective action of individuals chipping away slowly at the system that eventually we reach a tipping point where perhaps the whole system will collapse. It may not be the global capitalistic system, but the global health system as currently structured, it has to. So that's what keeps me
Yeah.
going.
Yes, I mean, I think to begin to wrap up, I mean, I think, as you said, we each, it's up to the African. We cannot outsource our decolonization. We cannot expect others to do it for us. Certainly not the colonizer. So it's going to take work. It's going to take an army, and it's likely going to take the current and next generations to do so. So as somebody, I mean, you said, you're 51. Thankfully, that means you have at least 30 more years to fight with us, or more. But what advice would you give to the next generation who are coming up, who risk becoming jaded because they are more impatient, which I think is a good thing. But they hit these blocks, which many times look just like them. It's easy to be blocked. It's easy to deal with block. In my own experience, when I'm blocked by somebody who doesn't look like me and who doesn't share my experience, I can chalk it up to their ignorance. But when I'm blocked by somebody who should know better, it can be much more frustrating and potentially cause you to give up or to become jaded. So, what advice would you give to this the current and coming generation, to keep up the good fight and to gradually, as you said, peck away at this institution that ultimately needs to be torn down?
Yeah, I hate to break the news, but change takes time. Change takes time. And if you expect change to happen very fast, I think you can be disappointed and maybe discouraged. And so while change takes time, it's important to know that there are steps. And as long as you can see yourself making progress, then you can assume that you don't know what's going to happen in the future. But if you have a theory of change, if I was to call it that, and you see things happening, then you can assume that you'll achieve the long-term change that you want to see. And I think there was, as I said, I was at a recent forum where this was discussed, and there was some good advice that if you're a young scientist, you're a young researcher, a young practitioner in Africa, it's good to be strategic. You don't want to ruin your career because you did certain things. You don't want to burn bridges. However, as I said, it's to calibrate what is possible where you are. It can't be that everything is going to ruin your career. There are things there are safe places. There are things that are within your power to change. So do those things, but just recognize that change takes time. And sometimes it's good to build your profile where you can be more effective than to sort of stifle your growth because maybe you peaked too early in your career. So you have to be strategic. The only thing I'll say is that once you reach a certain point, it is not acceptable and it is shameful that people are still paralyzed by this fear of something which might happen. And in a recent article, I said sometimes we fear shadows. We are so afraid, and what is keeping us actually shadows. Sometimes there's nothing, absolutely nothing. And I don't think there's ever been a time when the global health community has been attentive and receptive to difficult conversations. And so if you're still afraid now, then I don't know. Because if we lose this opportunity, then it might be lost. It might be lost forever. This is at least I don't know. For me, this is the most time that the world has been receptive to these conversations, and we cannot lose that opportunity. So wherever you are, calibrate. Don't rush. Calibrate what you can get away with. But we have to recognize that there's a certain point in your life, in your career, that you can be bold and without consequence, really. And so, and okay, damn, if there are consequences, then we deal with them. But we can't assume there always be consequences without even trying. And so far, for me, there've been none. So if you try and there are no consequences, maybe it gives you momentum to try again. But I think I'm convinced that sometimes we fear consequences that don't exist. And so yeah, but Africa is ours ultimately, and there's no one else who's going to save it for us. And
Africa is
sometimes,
ours.
yep, that may come with personal consequences. Many
Mm.
times, none.
Wow, I like that a lot. Africa is ours. Power is not ceded, right? It has to be taken.
Mhm.
Um, you have to build your platform to be able to really affect change, right? You're saying, you can't just sit if you're building your career and just be talking, right? You have to get to a point where your voice is powerful enough where you can speak without necessarily fear of losing the plates of food or whatever for your family. Those are really, you have to be strategic in how you approach these things. So really, really powerful advice for the young folks listening. Yes, yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, I was just thinking through some of, calibrate. I think it's something that, as I talk to young students, I think it's find a balance. But then at some point, you have to decide. You know what? Enough. Throw caution to the wind. And
Mm-hmm.
I think too often people hold on for too long, and then your voice is diminished. I think there are a few leaders who come to mind who are in their prime and should be more vocal, and for whatever
Mm.
reason they are timid. And I think, as Catherine said, in her experience, there haven't been consequences, and she's one of the most outspoken we know. So I think, and I fully agree. I think actually sometimes you gain respect because what you're saying is not what everybody knows. They just choose to ignore it. And whether it's guilt or it is whatever it is, once you call it out, you actually find lots of allies, whether they're real or fake allies. At least they pretend to be. And then you keep going
Mm.
about your business. So I think it can actually endear more people to your cause when you are willing to stand up and say what everybody else can see, but but perhaps no one is willing to point out. So I think, yeah, that's a great challenge to young people coming up to build up that sensitivity and to pick their moments. But ultimately, you have to jump into the pool, and I think we
Wow.
all have to find that moment when we jump. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you. Very nice summary. Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us for a truly unfiltered discussion on decolonizing global health. This is why we created this podcast. I think it was designed for you. So we're very happy that you came on and you shared your experience, your advice, your thoughts with our audience, and we look forward to having you again soon.
Thanks so much, Des, for having me, and thanks, y'all.